That morning, nobody knew the Seine River would become Europe's graveyard. March 28th, 845 AD, 120 Viking longships appeared through the morning mist, like ghosts of the damned. Their dragon prows cut through French waters, with the silence of death itself. At their head sailed the most feared name in Christendom, Ragnar Lodbrok, the scourge of the north, whose very name made kings tremble and priests pray for deliverance. Behind him came 5,000 warriors who had never known defeat, men who had burned monasteries from Ireland to the Baltic, who wore the gold of a dozen kingdoms around their necks, who carried axes still wet with the blood of those foolish enough to stand against them. Defending Paris stood the might of the Frankish Empire, 40,000 soldiers in gleaming mail, the largest army ever assembled to defend a single city. Veterans of campaigns against Saracens and Slavs, knights who traced their lineage to Charlemagne himself. They had never lost a battle on French soil, never seen their banners lowered in defeat, never imagined that salvation could arrive in the form of dragon ships sailing upriver like harbingers of the apocalypse. But the French had made a fatal mistake. They had prepared to fight the last war, not the next one. Their massive army was designed to crush enemies on open battlefields, to overwhelm with superior numbers and heavy cavalry, to use the ancient tactics that had built the Frankish Empire from the ruins of Rome. What they faced instead was something entirely new, a floating army that turned rivers into highways and water into a weapon, an enemy that could strike anywhere along hundreds of miles of riverbank, that could vanish before reinforcements arrived and reappear where least expected. The Vikings had spent decades perfecting river warfare, while Europeans still thought in terms of castles and cavalry charges. Each longship was a masterpiece of military engineering, shallow draft hulls that could navigate waters too shallow for any other warship, sails for speed in open water, oars for precision maneuvering in tight spaces, crews trained since childhood to fight from moving platforms. These weren't just boats. They were the most advanced weapons system of the age, and they had turned the city into a superhighway of destruction. King Charles the Bald faced the impossible choice that would define his reign. 40,000 men represented nearly the entire military strength of his kingdom. Every duke, every count, every fighting man who owed allegiance to the crown stood ready to defend Paris. But standing ready and being able to fight were two different things. How do you deploy cavalry against ships? How do you charge infantry across water? How do you use superior numbers when the enemy controls where and when battles are fought? The king who had inherited Charlemagne's empire was about to learn that some problems couldn't be solved with traditional solutions. Ragnar had studied European warfare for 20 years, had fought in Ireland, England, and Frisia. He understood exactly how Frankish armies operated, their strengths and their weaknesses, their tactics and their limitations. Most importantly, he knew they had never faced an enemy like him, an enemy that could bypass every defensive advantage they possessed, that could turn their own rivers into invasion routes, that could strike at the heart of their power while their armies watched helplessly from the banks. The Seine stretched like a silver serpent through the heart of Francia, from its mouth at the Channel to its tributaries deep inland. Viking ships could reach any settlement that depended on the river for trade, which meant almost every major city in the kingdom. Paris was just the prize, the symbol whose fall would prove that no place in Europe was safe from Norse axes, that the age of Frankish dominance was ending, that new masters ruled the waves and everything they could touch. March had brought the spring floods that made the Seine navigable to the largest ships. Waters ran high and fast, carrying the dragon fleet toward the heart of Christian Europe with the force of destiny itself. Local militias that tried to oppose the landings were swept aside like children before a storm. Town after town fell to Viking raids. churches burned, monasteries were plundered. The treasure of generations disappeared into the holds of dragon ships that seemed to multiply like serpents. The French response revealed everything wrong with European military thinking. Armies that took weeks to assemble and move. Supply trains that stretched for miles. Commanders who needed days to make decisions that Viking chieftains made in minutes. While Frankish nobles debated strategy in comfortable pavilions, Vikings struck like lightning and vanished before dawn. By the time French forces reached the scene of raids, they found only smoking ruins and tracks leading back to the river, back to ships that could be anywhere by sunset. Count Odo of Paris stood on the walls of his city and watched the horizon for salvation that might never come. The greatest fortress in Francia had never fallen to siege. Its walls were 10 feet thick. Its towers commanded every approach. Its garrison included the finest knights in Christendom. But walls meant nothing if the enemy controlled the rivers, if supply barges couldn't reach the city, if reinforcements were trapped on the wrong side of water controlled by dragon ships. For the first time in his life, the defender of Paris felt the cold touch of doubt. The psychological warfare had already begun. Village after village along the Seine reported the same sight: dragon ships appearing from nowhere, warriors pouring ashore like demons from hell, resistance crushed in minutes, then the ships vanishing back into river mist, leaving behind destruction and terror. The message was clear: nowhere was safe, no one could protect you. The Vikings could strike anywhere, anytime. Soon refugees clogged the roads to Paris, bringing tales of horror that spread panic faster than any army could march. But Ragnar's greatest weapon wasn't fear, it was speed. While French armies moved like vast, lumbering beasts, the Viking fleet flowed like quicksilver, ships that could cover 50 miles in a day, warriors who could disembark, raid a settlement, and be back on water before defenders even knew they were under attack. This wasn't warfare as Europeans understood it. This was something entirely new, something that made every traditional defensive strategy useless. The first test came at Rouen. The city controlled a crucial bridge across the Seine. Its capture would open the river road to Paris itself. 40 warships struck at dawn when the mist still clung to the water like grasping fingers. The garrison woke to the sound of war horns echoing across the river. Viking warriors were already scaling the walls when the alarm bells finally rang. By noon, its defenders lay dead in the streets. Its treasure filled Viking holds, and the road to Paris lay open. French armies converged on Rouen like wolves drawn to carrion. 20,000 men, under Duke Robertus, arrived 3 days too late. They found a city of ash and empty docks. The Vikings had vanished upriver, leaving behind only corpses and the stench of defeat. This became the pattern that would drive European commanders mad: always arriving after the slaughter, always finding cold trails and bitter lessons, never able to force the decisive battle that might turn the tide. What happened next shocked every military mind in Europe. Instead of chasing the Viking fleet upriver, French forces divided. Half remained at Rouen to rebuild its defenses. Half marched overland toward Paris, hoping to intercept the raiders before they reached the capital. It was exactly what Ragnar wanted. Divided enemies were weak enemies. Armies separated by rivers couldn't support each other. The ancient rule of war that demanded concentration of force meant nothing when your enemy could move 3 times faster than you could. The river war that followed redefined military thinking for generations. Viking ships struck simultaneously at points hundreds of miles apart. One squadron raided settlements near the mouth of the Seine, while another penetrated deep inland. French forces raced from crisis to crisis, always too late, always too few. Meanwhile, the main fleet approached Paris, like a dagger aimed at the heart of the kingdom. Each day brought new reports of disaster, new evidence that the old ways of war were dying in the smoke of burning towns. King Charles made his final gamble as March turned to April. He would concentrate every available man for the defense of Paris, strip the frontier fortresses, recall the frontier guards, stake everything on one massive battle that would either save the kingdom or lose it forever. 40,000 men represented the largest army ever assembled in France. If they couldn't stop 5,000 Vikings, nothing could. The die was cast. The stage was set, and death sailed upriver on dragon ships toward the greatest prize in Christendom. April 5th brought the sight that would haunt French nightmares for generations. Dragon prows emerging from morning mist like the ships of the damned, 120 vessels in perfect formation, sails furled, oars beating in rhythm that sounded like the heartbeat of war itself. At their head, the raven banner of Ragnar Lodbrok flew from the mast of the largest ship Europe had ever seen. Iron plates reinforced its hull. A golden dragon glared from its prow. This was no raiding vessel. This was a ship built to break kingdoms. The French army spread along both banks of the Seine, looked impressive to untrained eyes. 40,000 men in gleaming mail, banners snapping in the wind, cavalry horses prancing in formation, knights whose ancestors had conquered half of Europe, sitting their mounts like statues of war itself. But experienced warriors noticed what was missing. No boats, no way to reach an enemy that controlled the water, no plan beyond hoping the Vikings would be stupid enough to land where French swords could reach them. Count Gerard commanded the left bank with 15,000 infantry and 500 knights. Count Lupus held the right with similar numbers. Between them, the river ran like a silver barrier that might as well have been a mountain range. If the Vikings struck one side, the other half of the army could only watch helplessly. If they divided their fleet, French forces couldn't coordinate responses quickly enough to matter. The tactical situation favored the attackers so completely it seemed like a trap, which it was. But Ragnar had spent months planning this moment. His spies had mapped every ford, every bridge, every possible crossing point for 50 miles around Paris. He knew exactly where French forces were positioned, exactly how long it would take them to redeploy, exactly when and where to strike for maximum devastation. The French thought in terms of defending fixed positions. Vikings thought in terms of flowing like water around obstacles. Two completely different philosophies of war were about to collide with explosive force. The attack began where no one expected it. Not at Paris itself, but 20 miles downstream, at the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. 30 ships struck like lightning, while French attention focused on the main fleet. The monastery's treasures, accumulated over centuries, vanished into Viking holds within hours. More importantly, the raid proved that no position was safe, that the enemy could strike anywhere, that numbers meant nothing when you couldn't bring them to bear. French commanders reacted exactly as Ragnar knew they would: panic, confusion, orders and counter-orders that left armies marching in circles while Vikings moved with deadly purpose. Count Gerard rushed troops toward Saint-Germain, only to discover the raiders had vanished back upriver. Count Lupus prepared for assault on his positions, only to learn the enemy had struck elsewhere. The coordination that was supposed to be their strength became weakness when faced with an enemy that moved like quicksilver. But the real shock came when French forces finally engaged Viking raiders in what seemed like favorable circumstances. 2,000 Frankish infantry caught 100 Vikings burning a river village. The numbers seemed overwhelming, the outcome certain, until the fighting began. Viking warriors trained from childhood proved worth 10 French peasants pressed into service. Their axes cleaved through mail like parchment, their shields turned aside spear thrusts that should have killed. In 20 minutes, the cream of Frankish infantry lay dead in village streets, while Vikings loaded treasure and vanished back to their ships. Count Odo watched from Paris walls as smoke rose from a dozen burning settlements along the Seine. His garrison was strong enough to hold the city against any assault. His walls were thick enough to resist any siege engine of the age. But walls couldn't protect the countryside, couldn't save the monasteries and farms that fed the city, couldn't prevent Vikings from strangling Paris slowly by controlling the river that was its lifeline. For the first time, defenders began to understand they were trapped as surely as if they stood on an island in a hostile sea. The siege that followed defied every rule of medieval warfare. No camps around the city, no earthworks or siege towers, no massive assault on the walls. Instead, Viking ships controlled the Seine like a blockade. Nothing moved on the water without their permission. Supply barges trying to reach Paris were captured or burned. Merchants fled rather than risk their cargoes. Within days, the greatest city in France began to starve while its massive garrison could only watch helplessly. Future generations would study the Seine campaign as a masterpiece of military strategy, how a smaller force defeated a larger one through superior mobility and tactical innovation, how control of waterways trumped numerical superiority, how psychological warfare could be more effective than physical combat. The lessons would influence naval thinking well into the modern era. But the immediate impact was simpler. Ragnar had proven that Vikings were the new masters of European warfare. The silver trail that led from Paris to Scandinavia would be followed by thousands more raiders in coming decades. Men who learned that European weakness was real and profitable, who discovered that ships were more effective than armies for projecting power across long distances, who understood that fear was a weapon more deadly than any axe or sword. The precedent set on the Seine would echo through European history for centuries to come.